Welcome to Max and Madoke from Woman, and thank you again for coming back with this exciting topic. And I know this is just like an hour meeting, but the work which Max has put into this is much, much more, because, you know, I know his own standards, how much he wants to dwell everything in. So super excited to be here and very curious. Max, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tatiana, for this kind introduction. Well then, let's get started. I thought for the beginning I would briefly explain my general approach that I'm taking in these talks. So here are some previous talks that I presented at Deutsche Telekom, and the general idea has been to sort of take buzzwords such as responsible AI, agentic AI, trustworthiness, and try to tackle these buzzwords from a philosophical perspective as well as a technical angle. So, for example, for that matter, I discussed responsible AI. In another talk, we try to figure out what agency can be also from a philosophical perspective. And now agentic AI has become a very important topic as well. Well, and today we dive into trust and trustworthiness. So in general, the idea of my talk is, can we trust AI? And why do I want to take this approach? Because I believe too often experts in one domain, be it machine learning, data science, social science, or even philosophy, are oblivious to knowledge from other domains. And too often investors or politicians, for example, regulators, are quick to jump to conclusions without profound understanding of the concepts and technologies. So my message in my talks is, we should be careful when using philosophically rich concepts, and we should be prudent with what we say and how we say it. And if we do so, I think that this enables us to approach phenomena like artificial intelligence with enhanced realism, stronger scientific grounding, and increased caution. And with that, let's discuss trust in artificial intelligence. I will briefly touch upon a general characterization of trust, and then I will discuss trust from the perspective of two conceptual frameworks with regard to artificial intelligence. The first is based on trust between two possible artificial agents, and the second I call trust from context. After that, I would like to take a short break, because after the break, we will dive more into the data science and machine learning oriented debate on trustworthiness. And here I will give you an example of underspecified trust, as well as finally how we can also deal with trustworthiness in natural language processing. So we speak of trust in persons, in groups, in institutions, particular abilities, even technologies such as artificial intelligence. However, trust in the literature has been mainly conceptualized as an interpersonal relationship. That is, trust between two persons. And we shall start with this focus as well. Here's some terminology. Trustworthiness refers to the sense that some person X is trustworthy if we can trust X. A truster refers to the person who entrusts something to X. And a trustee refers to the entrusted person X. So why trust in general? Trust can increase cooperation with others because trust reduces the need for control and monitoring. Trust can increase meaningful relationships or attachments. Trust is important for knowledge. We must trust the testimony of others, such as scientists or even also victims. And trust, for example, of children and their parents allows them to mature. So what is trust? So we started with the idea that trust is mainly an interpersonal relationship. And according to Carolyn McLeod, the trust relation between two persons has three conditions. Trust requires that we can be vulnerable to others, that we can rely on others to be competent to deal with what we entrust them, and rely on them to be willing to do it. So therefore, trust comes also with many risks. And if we take a second brief look at the conditions of trust by MacLeod, we can see that there is a strong connection between trust and reliance. So it appears that trust is reliance plus some extra factor, also according, for example, to Harley. However, looking into the literature, there's no real consensus what this factor is so far. Interesting questions are, for example, can we will to trust? Can I really sit down and want to trust someone and then trust that person? And connected to that question is, I think, a question such as, or is trust a very passive emotion? Is trust then even a choice or not? And assuming that it might be a choice, at least to some extent, we may also ask, is trust rational or plausible? That means, do we have good reasons to trust someone? And I leave these questions to some extent open. As I said, there's unfortunately no definite answer to it. But I think they will resurface also in the two conceptual frameworks that I will now briefly introduce in this talk. So the first one follows Maria Rosaria Taddeo, who begins with modeling trust as a relationship not between two persons, but between two artificial systems. And she calls this idea e-trust. She defines trust as follows. Trust is often understood as a relation that holds when A, one of the parts, the truster, chooses to rely on another part, the trustee, to perform a given action, and B, this choice rests on the assessment of the trustee's trustworthiness. So what does that mean exactly? And what does it mean when we say, or when Taddeo suggests that we should assess the trustee? So in general, we can notice that trust is not a priori given here. It depends on the intended achievement of a specific goal for that particular action for which we trust a person, as well on the trustee's previous performances with respect to this goal. And Taddeo says that we should calculate the ratio of successful actions to total number of actions performed by the potential trustee to achieve a similar goal. So an interesting question would be what this ratio should look like. And I think, and Taddeo says as well, this is very much open to the user or designer of these systems. So a ratio might be 50% of successful performances, 70 or even 80. But there's more to it. Next to the ratio of successful performances, Taddeo argues that a system should consider the resources it saves by trusting another system. So what does that mean? She bases this argument on the minimax rule that is also known in game theory. And she suggests the following correlation between trust and resources. So if we, on the one hand, have the history of performances in mind, and then decide, or the system then needs to decide whether it should trust or not the other system, but it would save, let's say, no resources at all. It would still need to invest 100% of its resources. Then according to Taddeo's idea, there should be no trust. There should be a maximum of distrust. But the more resources are saved, that is, the less need to be invested. And the higher then this second sort of scale weighs into the trust. And then if the system absolutely saves 100% of its resources, it has, according to Taddeo, 100% reason to trust. So in some trust between systems is warranted, that means you're well-grounded, when the trustee has a history of successful performances for a given action, and the truster saves enough resources by trusting the trustee. So we can see here, for these reasons, that trust is for Taddeo mainly a rational choice, as well as a sort of, we can also say, verifiable belief. And finally, she suggests in her paper that trust of a human being in an artificial system should follow very much the same rationale. Okay, well then, Coeckelbergh argues that the previous account by Taddeo misses some fundamental aspects of trust. He observes, what matters is individual advantage and achievement of the individual goal, and then an objective assessment is made in order to decide whether or not to enter into the relation. Still, if we look at some further conditions of trust, we realize that trust is embedded in a more complex context. And that's also the reason why I call this approach trust from context. So Coeckelbergh says there are several preconditions, and the first is the ability to use language. So Taddeo assumes a clear communicative structure for trust that should be spelled out in terms of reasons, or can be also spelled out in terms of these formulae. However, trust may involve non-verbal communication as well. Think of a handshake, a subtle gesture, or even a body feelings. A second precondition for trust is freedom in uncertainty. For Taddeo, trust is a free and rational choice. However, Coeckelbergh argues, trust might be less under the individual's control. It is embedded in a broader social context. Think of children's trust in their parents. Think there is no real choice in trusting parents. One is sort of thrown into this relationship. Thirdly, another precondition according to Coeckelbergh are social relations in general. For Taddeo, trust is a constructed relationship by choice. So this relationship is only created when a truster starts to trust a trustee. However, again, Coeckelbergh argues, there's already a social relation which the persons experience as embodied and vulnerable beings that stand in relation, which forms the basis of trust, and which already entails a certain degree of mutual care and responsibility. So what does that mean when we then talk about trust in robots or other technologies as, broadly speaking, artificial intelligence? Coeckelbergh says robots may appear as more than machines, and this has consequences. Appearance making, sometimes named also deception, is part of the social game, and it does not undermine trust, but supports it. We trust robots if they appear trustworthy, and they appear trustworthy if they are good. So in other words, trust in advanced technologies such as robots or artificial intelligence systems is a somewhat inevitable phenomenon. For Coeckelbergh, trust in technologies is also culturally dependent. For example, in some cultures, care for the elderly with robots is seen less problematic. Think maybe of Japan. Cultures differ in how they word promises, expectations, and so on, and whether a robot or an AI system can particularly imitate this language of this culture will definitely make it more trustworthy. And concepts such as agent or freedom may be perceived differently in cultures with less individualistic foci. And this then, of course, will also have an effect on how we perceive trust in possible objects or machines. Then there is, I think, another sort of cognitive context that I would like to briefly introduce here, which is called automation bias or biases, which lead us to unreasonable trust in machines. Apparently, it's our human tendency to reduce our vigilance and oversight when working with machines. And there's one very interesting recent experiment by Dratsch on this question of automation bias. So in this experiment, instead of having two radiologists check mammograms for breast cancer, individual radiologists were paired with an algorithmic detection system for cancer that was manipulated by the scientists to make false predictions. And then they observed these single radiologists together with the algorithmic detection system, how accurate their predictions of cancer were in the study. And apparently the accuracy of the the radiologists for detecting cancer dropped from 80% to 22% for less experienced doctors, and from 80% to 45% for experienced doctors when working with these manipulated systems, which always made or more or less made false predictions. And these doctors were not told that the systems made false predictions, so they were kind of lured into this experiment to observe how much they trust the system or not, if we can speak of trust here. On the other hand, so I think to sum this up, so there's also the cognitive context, which makes us prone to trust machines maybe more than it is reasonable. But on the other hand, we may have difficulties to truly trust machines, also considering our human and social experiences, and in that also a certain context. Zachary Daus argues that trust is characterized by mutual vulnerability. So what is mutual vulnerability? It arises when two or more humans are subject to the same risk. For example, sailors to the risk of their vessel sinking, or professional employees to the risk of potentially negative failures. And therefore, it appears more difficult to trust when one is paired with an AI system, which is obviously not subject to the same shared risks during collaboration, which it never is, because it's not an employee, it's not a sailor, and so on. And for that reason, we may have a lot less trust than maybe superficially might be assumed. So some of you with a data science and machine learning background may know this famous and popular paper, Why Should I Trust You? Explaining the predictions of any classifier. In this paper, which introduces the so-called LINE method, local interpretable and model agnostic explanations, which is next to SHAPI, one key approach to explainable AI, a lot also is focused on trust, as the title already suggests. And when I read this paper, I mean, it's a very interesting paper. It's, I think, now cited over 20,000 times next to SHAPI. I think one of the foundational approaches to explain it about AI. Was still a little bit frustrated, let's say, or a little bit unhappy with how trust is approached in it. So I don't want to go too much here into the technical details, but to give those people who don't know the paper a brief idea of it, it tries to provide us with additional information how so-called classifiers work. So when we have a machine learning algorithm that is meant to detect images and provides for these images a label, be it electric guitar or Labrador, this system makes these predictions obviously based on certain information with certain features. And with more complex neural networks, for example, it has become very difficult to figure out what these features were. So the LIME approach helps us, which is sort of a second classifier built on the original classifier, helps us to figure out or detail out which features are of importance. So as we can see here in the pictures from the paper, when an algorithm predicts for the image in general electric guitar, the LIME method shows us that it made the prediction based on the pixels in this particular area. Okay, so that's in general the paper, and on numerous occasions, Ribeiro et al. Assert that LIME enhances trust. Just to give you a few ideas, they say understanding the reasons behind predictions is quite important in assessing trust, which is fundamental if one plans to take action based on prediction. If the users do not trust a model or a prediction, they will not use it. Trusting a model, that is, whether the user trusts a model to behave in reasonable ways if deployed, etc., etc. So nonetheless, the authors, as I mentioned before, provide no definition of what trust is, and I think it is left underspecified. So trust appears, at least, to be very much reduced here to transparency. And I mean, they don't say this is the sufficient and necessary condition for trust, as we like to say in philosophy, to know more about the prediction. So it's maybe just a partial answer to trust, but nevertheless, I think it's left underspecified. And there's an inflationary use here in this paper of trust without a real understanding of what trust could be, actually. So if we then consider the previously presented accounts, maybe according to McLeod's general conception of trust, Lime may help with convincing the truster in the competence of the artificial trustee, that is a model, for example. So that's how Lime can contribute to trust. If we consider today's conception of e-trust, we would not need to see why a classifier performs successfully. So the information would be irrelevant here, I think. We would need to know how many times it has performed successfully. And then next to that, how much resources we can save with it. And if we consider Coeckelbergh, we actually may assume a very sort of deflationist account of trust. That is trust without a very sharp definition. And then trust based on Lime as well can be assumed, I think, as it is immediately perceived by the model's users. And if the users have greater trust in the model with Lime, then the method increases the model's trustworthiness. Moving on to then another field sort of where trust has played a more important role just recently, in natural language processing. Here I would like to present you the following paper, Establishing Trustworthiness, Rethinking Tasks and Model Evaluation by Lichko et al. And in contrast to the previous paper, I find it quite nice here that they start off with an actual definition of trust. So for them, they say, it's a working definition, trust arises from knowledge of origin as well as from knowledge of functional capacity. Okay, how can work in natural language processing be aligned with this definition, which also serves, I think, here as a normative goal? And for that, I think we need to reconsider a little bit, let's say, the history of natural language processing. And until recently, much of the work in NLP could be, for example, characterized by David Schlang from the University of Potsdam, who summarizes the NLP work, at least up to the 2020s, as follows. So in NLP, we usually we focus usually, let's say, on a cognitive capability that's part of the capabilities of a competent language user. And then we wanted to develop a task for this capability. This task could be, for example, to identify so-called named entities, such as proper names. And based on that task, data was collected, or data was used that has already been collected. Usually the data collection was also already specified to the task with certain instructions. So mostly we were having corpora and annotators, and then based on this task, they were given instructions to annotate the data that could then be used for modeling. And modeling was mainly done, at least, I think, starting with the 2000s, with statistical approaches with machine learning. So a particular model architecture was then developed based on this data set for this task. And if this model if this model fared well, then we could at least to some extent argue that the model was able to represent a certain cognitive capability. And I think what's very important here to notice that this sort of pipeline approach on natural language processing was very compartmentalized. So we had kind of clear steps to take, and then also focusing just on one task, clear benchmarks, and then better models and greater data sets were developed, and then new tasks were added maybe, and so on. So this gives you, I think, a good idea of natural language processing up until very recently. And then in their paper, Lichko et al. Assess, However, the new generation of large language models, knowledge about model inputs, behaviors, evaluations, and data has been reduced. And here the focus is again on knowledge, which for them is the basis of trust. And why is that? Because with large language models, there's no clear definition of capabilities in advance, no clear definition of tasks, and so on. So I will come back to that just in a second. But in general, to give you an intuition, I think we left the comportment approach and have now this very broad, multivariate sort of approach. And that makes it very difficult for evaluations, for using appropriate data, and so on. So to regain knowledge with that trust when using large language models, Litschko et al. Have then identified multiple challenges tied to these large language models. So coming back to that in more detail. So let's have a look at model input. Contemporary representations have moved to subword level and are shared across words in different languages, obscuring our knowledge of the origin of their contents and requiring more complex lexical-semantic probing. So up until a certain point, large language models were trained with words, also known as tokens, but then they were even broken up into morphemes. And then these models were trained on morphemes. So even if we then, I think, apply line to some extent, then line will tell us a little bit about certain morphemes that contributed to a prediction of a certain model. But of course, for us, it's a lot more difficult to still understand or to still see patterns in this behavior. And then there's also model behavior. So large language models are usually trained on complex tasks in an end-to-end fashion, which makes it more difficult to expose intermediate outputs and analyze error propagation. So previously, when we started off with a single task, and when we realized a model did well on that task, we may have added a second task. But now, given, as mentioned previously, that we now have this multitude of tasks, and that they're not clearly defined, and the model is trained and still does, shows excellent performance in many of these tasks. This makes it even more complex and even more difficult to pin down certain correlations that we would like to have for a better understanding of these models. And then there's evaluation. So the situation is different when large language models are used to solve tasks outside of the benchmarks, which is often the case for real-world usage of large language models. So, we have these bunch of 10 benchmarks that were also ranked in leaderboards and so on, and these models are tested on these benchmarks, but then they're deployed in very different context. And these models behave also differently in these contexts. And this makes it very, very difficult for evaluating their true performance. And then there's, of course, data origin. So there's no minuscule collection of a certain corpus with annotations and so on. But today's models are instead trained on task heterogeneous corpora at web scale and typically of unknown provenance. So to mitigate these challenges and maybe to regain also some trustworthiness in natural language processing when working with large language models, the authors introduce or suggest the following solutions. So I think, they say, what's important is explaining the cognitive skills that are required beforehand and those that are also potentially employed by the model. Facilitating more holistic quality analysis, not only driven by a few benchmarks, but trying to have this broader evaluations for models. And then also, of course, being explicit about data provenance. So this will then help us, according to the authors, to increase our knowledge and in that also trust. So I think as with the Lime approach, trust here in the machine learning scene is very focused on transparency and explainability. And then the question is, I mean, will this make us trust artificial intelligence, I mean, in general, or even more? And to round this up, I present you here this idea by Honora O'Neill, which she gave in her Reith lectures from 2002 on trust as well, where she argues actually for less grandiose transparency with respect to trust in information sources, but rather calls for limiting deception in those sources. So maybe transparency is too easy, or is not all that there should be also in natural language processing. But for true trust in these greater trust in these systems, we may also need a limitation, for example, of deception. And trust, for example, that the designers take this by heart and that they truly try to reduce deception in these models. So that's about it here in my talk. But I think another interesting idea then is also, do we trust actually the artificial system, or do we trust more the designers and architects behind these systems, or do we trust the companies behind these systems? So I think this shows us right already that trust can be seen from very broad different angles, and I've tried to give you a general characterization of particularly interpersonal trust. I've also delved into two conceptual frameworks for trust in artificial intelligence, trust between two artificial agents that could also be a model for human trust into artificial agents. Then I showed you what trust could also involve, where trust also plays an important role given the context. And finally, we had a brief look upon some contemporary large language model debates with respect to trust, where I provided you with an example of underspecified conception of trust and, in general, an approach to trustworthiness in natural language processing. So I think what we can see, or what we can draw here from this talk finally, is that there are very heterogeneous conceptions and usages of trust. And I think it is very much worthy to consider the nuances of the concepts. And otherwise, I would suggest that we speak of reliability. Because I think when we speak of trust, as introduced with McLeod, trust is something that involves reliability plus an extra factor. Otherwise, I mean, we should stick to the concept of reliability. And without knowing what this extra factor is, I would be careful with using the word trust. So in general, then, to conclude this talk, I think if we have a better understanding of trust, and we can have a better definition of this extra factor, also given the context and given the applications, then I think we can also create more trustworthy systems. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm very much happy to connect with all of you. So if you're interested in keeping in touch also regarding other topics in machine learning and philosophy, very happy to connect, for example, on LinkedIn.